First question via the fax comes to us from Cuba, and here it goes. Do millennials tend to prefer the study and practice of the basic and exact sciences, such as mathematics and physics, more than the behavioral sciences, such as sociology and management, as a result of their affinity for new technology?
Certainly some of them have been introduced to some of the harder sciences because of their interest in technology and computer science and the like. But the underlying, the larger sciences like higher mathematics or physics are not necessarily what young adults are interested in. Many have an incredible entrepreneurial spirit, and the behavioral sciences still appeal to them because they help them develop their craft, develop an understanding of people, and that can be applied to business. So I think it's a mixed group. There certainly is some real interest in technology at least, but not necessarily the hard sciences.
All right. Our next question comes from Pachuca, Mexico. Go ahead, please.
If we consider how close we are to the United States, when do you think the millennial generation in Mexico will reach that of the millennial generation in the U.S.?
I think that if the question is will they reach the same sort of numbers or level of development, I mean, I think that's already happening. I think the exchange between Mexico and the U.S. in particular, although between much of Latin America now, because so much of the migration is no longer simply between the two countries, but between many. I think this is already underway. I think you may not see the changes or the sort of characteristics in exactly the same form that you'll see them in the United States, but the underlying trends and the sort of underlying global characteristics remain across, whether in Mexico or the U.S. And the exchange between cultures and between people in the U.S. and Mexico is two-way. It's very powerful, and it impacts youth in the U.S. as well as youth in Mexico.
All right. We remain in Mexico for our next question. Go ahead, please.
Is Mr. Hernandez calling? And my question is, if the millennial generation, if they have more local differences or more global coincidences, that is, how can you differentiate this generation? More local differences compared to other generations, or with more similarities in the global arena? And how many demographic studies have been conducted to identify these differences or these similarities?
That's a magnificent question, and one I'm very glad that you asked, because this is something I would like to address. There are both local differences and global commonalities among people of different generations, and millennials have more in common globally than do older generations. They cross a cultural, they have a more common culture. That said, the way it manifests itself differs at a local level, and there are not a lot of studies, surveys, or analyses at this point that take the sort of global framework, the generational framework that we talk about here today and that we've talked about in previous programs, and sort of apply that framework to the local population or regional population. And this is something I would love to see, because I think it is a framework that you can define the characteristics, more specific characteristics within. So it's both global and local, and filling in the local pieces is something that requires local work and local analysis.
All right, very good. Thank you. Our next question comes from Lima, Peru. Go ahead, please.
We're calling from Peru, and our question is, what does the millennial generation have to face in the workplace? That is, the greatest percentage of the workforce. What generation do you think they are from?
Right now, the workforce is primarily made up of the baby boom generation. And the millennial generation is beginning to move into the workforce. This is the life stage they are in, is the one at which you make the transition from being a student or a dependent into independence and work. Generation X is squeezed in the middle. And this is where the large millennial generation has some advantages because they will be moving behind a small generation, Generation X, and will have the opportunity to sort of move into empty spaces. But at the same time, they're competing with the large baby boom as they move up the ladder. The good news is the baby boom will retire, begin retiring in 10 years, opening up more jobs everywhere, which will be necessary. A lot for the millennials, though, will depend on the global economy and job growth.
Thank you for your insightful questions and responses. Let's now move again to your important messages on the topic of this program.